Hello again. Welcome back to a special issue of China's DeepSeek Moment series with a very special guest today, Gary Rieschel, who's here first and foremost as the chair of HSAT in Northern California and Seattle, with whom we're co-hosting today's series on biotech in China. But before we dive in, let me take a moment to set the stage for this special series. Our Center for China Analysis, with 55 fellows now in 12 countries, is funded with the mission to become a global center on China. Because China, as we all know, is truly a global topic with a global interest. And we, when we funded, want to become a non-DC-centric with a holistic and pluralistic approach on China, and to see China from within, not from without. So this series is part of that mission. In collaboration with HSAT's global centers, which is a unique advantage of our platform, we are looking for the next big breakthrough moments in China's technological development and its implication on the global stage. So we are very fortunate to start with two places that embody the spirit of innovation and global engagement, San Francisco and Seattle. Hence, our special guest today, Gary Rieschel, the chair of HSAT centers in Northern California and Seattle. But Gary is so much more than that. So before I turn to our moderator today, let me briefly introduce him in three simple ways. First, Gary is the founding managing director of the Qiming Venture Partners, which he launched in Shanghai in 2006. Qiming is widely recognized as the leading healthcare investor in China, and Gary himself, the godfather of the China's biosector investment. He's one of the most experienced and respected investors in China's biotech ecosystem, so he has a lot of insights to offer. Second, Gary is one of the sharpest and most rational voices, as far as I'm concerned, on US-China tech front. As the founder of the Big Bang Dialogue, he has been bringing together some of the most interesting minds in the field, and he's consistently ahead of the curve. So we should listen to him very carefully. But finally, on a personal note, Gary simply is a fun and wise person. So beyond being a very avid skier, golfer, and fisherman, and scuba diver, he has been a mentor to countless entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and even regular people like myself. He has a lot to offer. And I want to finish by a line from another equally fun and wise person, Yuka. Gary's human brain is more insightful than DeepSeek, and I hold a lot of truth to that. And with that, I want to turn to Lizzi to start the real conversation with Gary. So over to you, Lizzi and Gary.
Thank you so much, Jing, for that terrific introduction. I am so honored to host you today, Gary. And to our audience, hello and welcome back to this episode of ASPE's CCA webinar series, China's DeepSeek Moment. I am Lizzi Li, fellow on Chinese economy here at CCA. This is actually the third episode in our DeepSeek Moment series, where we examine unexpected tech breakthroughs from China, unpack the forces driving them, and explore their global implications. China's recent advances in AI certainly caught many by surprise, but a quieter revolution is actually happening, this time in biotech, one that could be just as consequential. So our guest today, Gary Rieschel, founding managing partner of Qiming Venture Partners and a leading investor in China's bio-ecosystem. He will help us unpack the complicated dynamics behind this phenomena and help us understand what will happen in the future. Gary, thank you so much for being here with us, and let's dive right in.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
So China's AI moment came when companies like DeepSeek shocked global audiences with capabilities many assumed were still years away. And some are now asking whether we're at a similar inflection point in biotech. So Gary, do you see parallels between China's biotech rise and its recent AI breakthroughs? Or are we actually reaching a similar moment where the world totally underestimated China's biotech capabilities, and it's finally coming to a realization of it?
I think it's a great question, and it stems from the fact that the biotech evolution has been different than the DeepSeek moment. The DeepSeek moment was a company that people really had no idea was working on this. The other AI companies in China were equally shocked as the American AI companies were when DeepSeek announced its technology, and they were even more shocked when it was made open source. So they've now all adopted a number of the different algorithms that DeepSeek had done. The biotech, thinking about what's happening in biotech as a DeepSeek moment may not be a great comparison. The biotech evolution in China has occurred at an accelerating pace over the last 20 years. And it was coming off of a very low base. China was spending about 2.5% of GDP on healthcare in 2005 when I first moved to China. And that's what led us, when we created Qiming, what led us to create a dedicated healthcare practice was the sheer need that was obvious in the Chinese market at that time. They had the largest lifestyle disease population, and that's been continuing to explode over the last 20 years. The cancer population in almost every measure is the largest on the planet. And so you had this huge, massive need in the market. And then what happened is all the major pharmaceutical companies were setting up labs in China. And those labs were populated largely by what were called sea turtles, which were the Chinese researchers that had been educated overseas, very, very skilled and talented people. And they went back to China and they went back to work in these labs. And what was fascinating was the labs by themselves. They brought back thousands of Chinese researchers into these labs. The labs by themselves were not successful for the big pharma companies like Pfizer, Lilly, and Merck, et cetera, in terms of creating novel new products to feed the pipeline of these large pharmaceutical companies, largely because they never really treated these labs as a core part of their full research operation. So they were viewed as outposts, but they were never really fully embraced by the headquarters. But what happened is you had thousands of very talented people who'd gone back to China, were working on projects, and they could see for themselves, like all entrepreneurs in China do, where that need was. So over to the first 4 to 5 years, they were in the labs, but starting around 2008 and 9, they were leaving the labs. And so because they were limited in their scale and ambition to not compete with the main headquarter labs initially, so this hindered their ability to innovate and create incentives for the best researchers to stay. So those researchers began to leave. So it's really around 2010 where the intellectual seed corn started to appear in the entrepreneurial ranks in biotech in China. So you had that massive need. The venture capital industry had evolved to provide more and more capital available to fund these startups. And then you finally had the talent come together with that.
Fantastic. So it seems a quieter version of the DeepSeek breakthrough. You see this shift in China from generics to cutting-edge biotech as a result of a long-term strategy, but also, in recent years, there seems to be this acceleration of progress for China to get there. So you unpack the talent factors. Are there policy support, capital factors, investment reasons that have propelled China's biotech sector forward, especially in recent years? What are the other factors that enable this transformation?
So there was a realization by the central government in 2006 that the healthcare system was very, very corrupt and very inefficient. Very few countries have actually executed the head of their Food and Drug Administration, but China executed the head of their Food and Drug Administration in February of 2007. And what that was an indication of was that the system needed to be completely redone from the top down. And so that cleanup and that, shining a bright light on how inefficient and how ineffective that system was, I think was very, very beneficial for the entrepreneurs to see an opening that actually the government was going to support more of an innovation engine. I think that it's also important to understand that you can't have a biotech sector and do really innovative or first-in-class molecule work without having a very, very robust diagnostics business. So that in the 2004, 5, 6 timeframe began to be created in China. You need to have the reagents business. That was also created during that time in China. And then maybe most importantly, you needed to have world-class clinical trial capabilities. So there was a company, Dr. Ye, who was at Roche, started a company called TigerMed in 2004. And TigerMed was the first Chinese, what they call CRO, clinical research, clinical operations company, to really operate at a world-class level. And Qiming was fortunate enough to be the only investor in TigerMed before it went public. So TigerMed, over a number of years, initially its business was 95% trials for generic pharmaceuticals. In 2005, there was only one novel compound approved for release in China. So that was not a very robust ecosystem at all. But once you started to have the diagnostics capability, you had the labs, then you had TigerMed basically providing a world-class data review and data analysis, the same as Quintiles in the US. Then suddenly you actually started the formation of that ecosystem where the research could actually be brought into trials in China, and those trials were respected at a world-class level. So there are a lot of pieces that actually had to come together to create this ecosystem, some of which were not terribly exciting. Diagnostics were not viewed as terribly exciting, but you needed to have that capability in order to further the research on cancer and some of the lifestyle diseases that were becoming so prevalent in China.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight. One of the biggest shifts I'm seeing now is Western pharmaceutical companies increasingly turning to China. So why are so many US and European pharma firms looking to China for drug discovery? That's quite stunning to me.
Well, yeah, you're correct. I mean, I think in the last 3 to 4 years, it's been close to $100 billion of license fees paid by foreign pharmaceutical companies to Chinese firms. Well, when you look at, why is that happening? So there are a couple things. So one, you can now trust the data, you can trust the trial execution in China. So the pharmaceutical companies, when they license something, they have to know that what they're licensing is real. And before 2010, 2009, you would not have been able to do that in China. The quality of the trials, the quality of the data analysis was really not sufficient. Now that has become world-class. It operates at the same level of standard of quality of any of the European Union, Japan, the United States, and so on. The second thing was, the talent was key, but people forget about just the innate entrepreneurism of a lot of the Chinese researchers and scientists. So you have this massive market demand. You see cancer rates all over the place in China. You see the lifestyle disease rates. So you're playing into something where the domestic market starts to drive that demand. The domestic market has been the key for the success of every Chinese technology company. Very, very few have been successful, whether it's tech, biotech, doesn't matter, have been successful starting overseas. They started based on a huge domestic market. So you had the huge domestic market, you had the researchers that were turning into entrepreneurs, you had the rest of that ecosystem there. But this was not, it's very interesting because this was not directed by the central government. This was something that was the need was being met by the researchers and the entrepreneurs, and they were starting to feel comfortable that, again, that in the creation of that entire ecosystem was able to, facilitate this. So then the large foreign firms, their own labs, the Merck labs, Pfizer, et cetera, they started to look at what was happening in China and realize this capability is really significant. So then they started to do the licensing, but it wasn't until about 2020, 2019, where you started to see the license numbers become really interesting in terms of what that meant for funding these Chinese startups and these Chinese entrepreneurs. But it's driven by the fact that there's hundreds of billions of dollars coming off patent globally. And the pharmaceutical companies, their own pipelines, they have not been able to fill their own pipelines. So they have to look for other places. So now in China, you can get drugs to market faster because the large native population in China, naive population that hasn't been exposed to a lot of trials is there. And then you have the researchers and you have the talent to do the analysis of things. So the entire ecosystem was just waiting for this moment. So in that sense, the DeepSeek moment probably occurred when the ESCO drug came out and was twice as effective as Keytruda. So then you had, and it was interesting, it was not covered that way at the time, but you had a drug that doubled the life expectancy of lung cancer patients. And it was solely developed, all the technology, all the intellectual property, everything solely developed in China. And that was a shock to the global biopharma, market. And that, I think, has been a large accelerating factor in this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gary, for the insight. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the controversies around China's model. This is actually a concern brought to me by an industry practitioner based in China. She thinks China's licensing model, well, currently it helped China become a biotech powerhouse, might also risk positioning, Chinese firms as suppliers rather than global leaders in the long run. What's your take on that? Does the licensing model help China in the long run, or does it actually hurt?
So it's a very interesting situation in pharma globally. Startups in the United States, just like startups in China, have almost no chance to bring a drug to market by themselves. The cost of running large-scale pivotal trials at the back end of a drug process dwarf the ability of virtually all the startups in the United States and certainly in China to fund. And so you could make that statement, and you could say, well, it will hold them back. But this licensing phase is a necessary step to get to the point where there will be some major Chinese pharmaceutical companies that can actually handle global distribution, global trials, et cetera. Right now, there's Hengrui. There are two of the world's 30 largest pharmaceutical companies, 2 are in China. And so that is not a robust, on that stage, that's not a robust ecosystem. The innovation ecosystem is phenomenally robust right now in China, but the back-end distribution and global trial capability lacks. And that will take a decade. That will take some real time.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much. Also, another pushback on China's sort of biotech breakthrough. A lot of the conversation around Chinese biotech currently focuses on efficiency, so basically faster and cheaper drugs, but not necessarily first-in-class breakthroughs. One pushback I heard from a practitioner based in the U.S. is that while China is still in a catch-up phase, it's not more innovative in the traditional sense. But my question to you is, if Chinese firms can bring better, safer versions of existing drugs to market twice as fast, and at lower cost in many cases, does it actually make us redefine what we value as innovation? Should global pharma sort of change their way to approach innovation, or is what China is currently doing is not really innovation in that sense?
This is where the comparison with tech is quite interesting. China's tech industry has now been widely accepted as being innovative. It didn't create the cell phone, it didn't create an electric vehicle, but it has become, because of the rapid iteration and the ability to take something and make it better cycle by cycle by cycle. And the Chinese are they're among the very best, if not the best in the world at that. The tech world got over its bias that wasn't innovation and now realized that really is innovation. And in fact, that's where most of the commercial benefit comes from. This is exactly the same situation in biotech. So the idea that you have not created yet first-in-class breakthroughs. Well, if everything you do makes those first-in-class breakthroughs better over the following 3 to 5 years, that's a huge benefit to society as a whole. Because it's going to be rare that the first-in-class breakthrough winds up being the best in class over the course of a decade or something after that. Going back to the Akeso, the one that bested Keytruda, that could move to being a best-in-class drug. And it's very, very strong protein engineering capability by the Chinese firm. So now that 25% of new drug developments in China, 40% in the U.S., all the licensing was over $40 billion last year. One would have to say that there's real value being created in that Chinese ecosystem. And when I talk to the researchers that I respect in the U.S., they will say 10 years ago, China was 20 years behind the United States in terms of first-in-class drug development. Today, they're 2 to 3 years behind. That's a phenomenal compression of time in the course of just a decade. And so I think it's very fair to say that we're going to see in the very near future, especially with some of the antibody chemo combinations. You'll see real innovation coming out of China, real first-in-class drugs coming out of China that no one else in the world has developed yet.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. I want to turn to policy a little bit. Surprisingly, unlike in AI or semiconductor, biotech hasn't been a major target in US-China tech competition or in US-China tech competition policy. Is biotech seen as too critical to national health security to be cut off, or do you think a tightening of policy is still inevitable in the future?
So I was part of some of the discussions on the Biosecure Act and spent quite a bit of time on some of the other US tech, more tech-oriented policy work. I would say that the folks in Washington, D.C. are rather frustrated because they would really like to think that in biotech, you have the same kind of choke points that you have in the semiconductor industry. In the semiconductor industry, if you throttle 4 or 5 companies, Tokyo Electron, ASML, et cetera, you can really hold back what someone can develop, or you can certainly slow them down. The biotech industry doesn't have those choke points. Some of the world's top genetic processing companies are already in China, the equal of Illumina. So there isn't that place where you can say, we can just stop doing this. The alternative is to say, okay, so we're not going to import Chinese drugs to the United States. So then you get to tell patients in the United States that are suffering from a form of cancer that China has a solution for. You're going to say, well, you get to die because we're not going to import drugs from China. That is not a great message for humanity or for politics. So I think that what you have is you just have to have a realization. AI is also very, very hard to find choke points around AI. AI and biotech are ones where you have brilliant people, you have all the capability, all the necessary skill sets, you have large domestic markets. So constraining development in China, Secretary Raimondo used the term fool's errand, and I would completely agree with that.
Thank you so much. But now, we see President Trump threatening new tariffs, not just against China, but in U.S. trade partners as well. If the United States indeed impose trade restrictions on Chinese biotech, can you sort of help us walk through what that would mean for licensing deals and for global supply chains?
So, this is a very interesting question. So you could put tariffs on reagents. So China has about 70+% of the world's reagent market for biopharmaceuticals. And so that's something that the US is very dependent, the world is very dependent upon China for that. Because that's a defined chemical, you could definitely put a tariff on that. If you're licensing a drug that has not yet been approved, what do you put a tariff on? So the worry about tariffs in the biotech world, if China starts to come out with many first-in-class, best-in-class drugs, and Trump wants to say, well, that has to be the license fee, there's a tariff on that drug, so you have to pay some tariff. I'm not really sure how they would define it. Even if they defined it, the scary thing in the US is the US ecosystem for healthcare is so inefficient. The prices are already 10 times what it would be in China for the same drug. 30 times for a recent drug comparison. So I'm not sure the tariffs are really going to do much at all. All you're going to do is make the problem in the US dramatically worse in terms of the cost structure and inefficiency, and it's already quite bad for that already.
What about investment restrictions or export restrictions to China? How will that affect Chinese biotech firms?
Export restrictions for products and technology. I think China's ecosystem for biotech now is approaching the area I would call self-sufficiency. I'm not sure what it would really need from the US. Again, at that very, very inventive stage of first in class, you would probably be able to constrain some of the development in China if you decided that that was a humane thing to do. Which again, then you get into a much broader discussion on whether that really is the right thing to do for humanity. In terms of the rest of it, for the export restrictions, all you're going to do again is you're going to be hurting American firms. Because once a drug is sent to China, it's very hard to reverse engineer a drug. That takes a great deal of time. And I'm not sure that the Chinese firms are really focused on doing that anymore. I think on the investment restrictions, and I've also spent some time with the CFIUS and the reverse CFIUS acts on this. You would certainly, if this had happened 20 years ago, and you had said you're not going to be able to put money into biotech firms in China and help them grow and help them develop and provide the expertise, you probably would have been able to restrict the development of China, or certainly slowed it down. The challenge you have now are two things have changed dramatically. Number one, virtually all the VCs in China are, guess what, Chinese. So the US law doesn't apply if you say, well, we don't want Americans. Well, they're not Americans, they're Chinese. The dollars have largely switched from being all the innovative dollars being really focused from all the innovation money being dollars focused on that to now mostly largely RMB, as you'd also expect in a largely and rapidly evolving domestic market. So the impact from the US of restricting investment by venture firms in biotech, I think it's one, going to be very hard to define. Number two, I don't think it's going to have as meaningful impact on slowing down China's biotech investment at this point.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of China's sort of domestic ecosystem, we talk about domestic investment, domestic VCs, we talk about domestic innovations. What about policy with China's focus on silver economy, with its aging society? How does that sort of change the landscape or the shape of the landscape of China's biotech industry?
So it's certainly, so as I mentioned earlier, when I moved to China in 2005, it was roughly 2.5% of GDP was on healthcare. Now you can see numbers 7 to 8%. So it's increased dramatically. That the aging population in China is actually one, it's unfortunately, like it is in every country, it's a huge market. Because again, that's where lifestyle disease, cancer, dementia, all these long-term chronic disease cases kick in. And so that's a huge market demand. China's issue is going to be, how do you pay for that? And how do global pharma wind up address pricing issues? So China will be one of the first places where you see real tension between a patient in the US paying X, a patient in China paying 1/10 X. Or the US paying 10 times what the Chinese patient is paying. And I think that will really challenge some of the global pharmaceutical models. And that is an area where both governments, the Chinese government and the US government, could reach some accommodation and could have some understanding about this. But that will be the pricing issues for these drugs, addressing the aging population in both countries or aging populations around the world, the pricing around that will become a major issue.
Well, thank you so much. And back to policy making, DC policymakers have been raising national security concerns about big pharma's reliance on Chinese drug innovation related to cost factors, as we discussed. Help us sort of understand that concern. Should U.S. regulators view this as a risk similar to, past dependence on Chinese manufacturing, for example, or is it more like a political statement rather than like an actual national security statement?
I think separating the political statements around security from the real statements around security is a very difficult challenge right now. Both countries have embraced the idea that almost everything can be a national security concern. I think the real issue on pharmaceuticals as it relates to security came from the supply chain issues when people realized so much of the diagnostics capability, the Chinese device market, so many of those products were mission critical in the US, and there was really only one source, and that source was in China. So you saw firms start to look at diversifying supply chains, reagents for pharmaceutical development. If China chose to just simply say, just like rare earth metals, say, we're just simply not going to support exporting reagents, they would shut down a good part of the global pharmaceutical industry. And clearly, again, then you get into, this is a humanitarian issue. This is not simply a geopolitical issue. So I think there is a real concern on diversification of supply chains. I think a lot of the major pharmaceutical companies are nervous about where the policies will go. I personally don't. I have an idea in terms of, I think we'll side on the humanitarian doing what's right for humanity as opposed to trying to couch everything under a security issue. But I don't see security being the driving concern in this. I think supply chain diversification is really that's where I think the security issues will wind up residing.
So what about data integrity or safety standards when it comes to Chinese development drugs entering the US market? There's also that conversation in some policymaking corners.
It used to be the case that the data around a trial in China was not reliable. That is not the case anymore. There's a gentleman, Bob Lee, who was at Memorial Kettering in New York, Sloan Kettering. And he was one of the first to bring Chinese drugs and to get it through the entire process in the United States. And that provided quite a bit of credibility and made you realize that if you work with the professional organizations in China and you work with the right trial partners, you can trust that data. The question around patient data and the question around a Chinese citizen's data and American citizen's data, right now that is creating a problem in terms of it induces inefficiency. The fact that we can't accept the data more broadly slows down the process for drug approval in the United States. And that's something that, Jing has been working on. And I think there's a great deal of, there should be some effort around trying to be realistic and say, the data standards for patient data between the US and China, we should be able to reach some accommodation on that. We should be able to reach some guardrails that both sides can accept. And we'll have to see. I mean, AI is somewhat leading the train on this because everyone's concerned about what kind of data they're collecting about you and collecting about me, who gets to use the data. The healthcare industry has always had very restrictive access to patient data. AI is going to cause some rethinking of that and what that actually means. I actually think you can keep patient data completely secure, but everyone always points to the case of 1 in a million here or 1 in a billion there, and we'll just have to see where that goes.
Thank you so much, Gary. And finally, turning to multinational corporations. For multinational corporations in the pharma industry and related industries, what are the risks when it comes to China that they must be aware of, given your deep expertise in China, spanning multiple decades? What are the opportunities for them you see at this point? And what are some of the actionable strategies you would propose or suggest to them?
Well, I think the actionable strategy that they embarked on 20 years ago was setting up the labs so they had visibility into what was being developed in China. They didn't take the full advantage of that. Now you have a number of companies that are actually really world-class companies in China. So now the pharmaceutical companies the global pharma companies are figuring out what they need to license, how to fill their own pipeline with potential products from China, the next in-class drugs, the ones that we talked about, the next better drugs. So they've already embarked upon that. Now the big question for them will be, what is their investment in China? In other words, they'll have to decide, is the Chinese market something where they want to reach some accommodation on bringing their drugs into China and not pulling back from China? And I think that's going to be a painful discussion because it's going to be expensive for them to do business in China. The competitive landscape in China is dramatically different. For the pharmaceutical companies, it's still a good market or a good environment. If you're a device company, trying to compete with the Chinese is almost impossible. The Chinese are simply better, and they've been faster, and they've reached world-class scale in virtually every aspect of devices. And so the pharmaceutical companies still have an advantage, but they're going to have to figure out what their engagement strategy is. Right now it's licensing. Could it be more M&A? Because there's really no M&A market in China for pharmaceuticals or for tech. That's a huge weakness of China's capital market structure. And so the foreign firms have an advantage there, but they're going to have to decide to do that. And there will be geopolitical concerns about acquiring Chinese companies. How do you do diligence on that process? But I think that's the next step. They have to decide if they want to take that step.
Fantastic. And the patient data Gary alluded to is part of the Cure for Cancer initiative, which is another flagship major project that CCA is currently working on healthcare. And we'll make sure to include a link in the description section of this video. Our audience who are interested in should check out the other major health initiatives that we are currently working on. This is such a fascinating space to watch. And Gary, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And to our audience, thank you so much for watching this episode of China's DeepSeek Moment with ASPE's Center for China Analysis. Please stay tuned for more discussions on China's evolving role in global innovation.